Hello, everybody, and welcome to the fifth in this series of online talks. Today, I'm going to talk about Castle Howard in the modern world. It will deal with quite a lot of restoration, but will then end with who we are and what we do today. And at that point, the slightly bizarre title will, I hope, become clear to you. Well, here is Castle Howard today, 300 years after building work began, and what we witness is a construct that has reached maturity. The architecture, the decor, and the terrain appear complete and are, of course, breathtakingly impressive in terms of scale, beauty, and grandeur. But Castle Howard is also like this swan in the foreground, fabulously graceful on the surface, but beneath the waterline, doing what all swans do, paddling like mad. And Castle Howard has been like this for the past 70 years or so, strenuously looking after itself since the single event that has dominated its recent history, the terrible fire of 1940, which swept through the southeast wing and central block of the house, destroying the dome, some 20 rooms, and numerous treasures. And when the late George Howard returned from the war, he unexpectedly inherited Castle Howard after the deaths in action of his two brothers. But this was a family home gutted by fire and largely open to the skies. And moreover, in addition to the fire damage, much of the stonework to the house was in poor condition, the grounds were overgrown, the lakes silted up, and the parkland in poor repair. And many of the monuments were in danger of collapse. But disaster has also led to recovery, gradual triumph in the face of adversity, and the achievements since the end of the Second World War now form a chapter in the history of the house every bit as important as the accomplishments of previous centuries. Repair, restoration, and recreation have all sought to preserve the ethos of Castle Howard in ways that reflect its rich heritage and tradition that has always been dynamic and forward-looking. Quite simply, Castle Howard is a place where nothing stands still. This immense cycle of restoration and recovery began in the 1950s, when the most urgent task was to save Vanbragh's Temple of the Four Winds, which was in an endangered condition. As you can see on the right, the ceiling and the dome were collapsing, infested with dry rot and beetle damage, and much of the stonework had eroded. And with the help of a grant from the Ministry of Works, that's the predecessor to Historic England today, a restoration program was begun in 1956. And a new dome for the dome, a new frame for the dome was constructed in a workshop down in Doncaster, initially as an entire unit. And you can see the ribs of the dome on the left before it was clad in plywood. And then, rather surprisingly, it was separated into 4 quadrant sections and transported to Castle Howard by road. And then these segments were hoisted onto a ramp beside the temple, and stage by stage, the new dome took shape before it was eventually covered with wooden boarding and sheet leading, and a new wooden turret placed on the top. And following that, work on the portico and the plinth began, and the interior was restored too. Shortly afterwards, attention was turned to the house itself, of course, lacking its crowning dome since the fire. It was a maimed and incomplete building. The priority was to rebuild the dome, but with no surviving plans or drawings, the size and proportions of the dome had to be reconstructed using the technique of photogrammetry. This involved looking at pre-fire photographs and from these recreating the dimensions of the dome accurately enough to produce measured drawings and then a model. An actual rebuilding began in 1960, As first, a timber frame was constructed, much like we have seen with the temple, and then the structure was lined with lead. And the colossal busts that had also been lost in the fire, each weighing nearly a ton, were carved and then hoisted onto the entablature outside the dome, some 70 feet above the ground. And finally, the cupola on top was crowned by a lantern and a finial, and these were gilded, as you can see on the right. Now, the gilding for the top section lasts on average 25 years, and 2 summers ago, it was re-gilded for a 3rd time since 1961. And a rough calculation looked at about 1,000 sheets of gold leaf, wafer-thin gold leaf, being applied to the finial at the top here. A sheet of gold leaf is roughly the size of a playing card. Now, it's so thin that if you had rolled all those sheets up together, it would have weighed perhaps no more than 16 grams, perhaps the weight of a light bracelet, and perhaps would have been no bigger than a marble in size. Well, with the external structure rebuilt, it was also possible to recreate the interior. When the dome had crashed to the floor in the fire, not only were the lantern and cupola lost, but also Pellegrini's painting of the Fall of Phaeton on the underside, painted in the early 18th century. And following the fire, as you can see on the right, the open space had been sealed up by a wooden cap. So with the rebuilding of the dome came the opportunity to recreate this dramatic painting. And in 1962, Scott Mead, a Canadian artist, was commissioned to reconstruct Pellegrini's masterpiece. As with the building structure, there were no original drawings or cartoons to base the work on. All that remained was one single black and white photograph of the original painting. But after research into the color and design of Pellegrini's work elsewhere, Mead was able to reproduce the celebrated episode from classical legend. He had to work on a platform on the top of a 60-foot high scaffold with safety netting, specially made by a firm of ship riggers in Hull, suspended below. And finished in 1963, this whole project of repainting the Pellegrini cost £55,000. Well, downstairs in the building, the fire damage has been partly made good too. In the 3 main rooms in the central block on the western side of the hall, new floorboards were laid in the shell of the cabinet room. Here is the cabinet room before and after, a typical pairing of pictures showing the level of destruction. But there's a revealing story to the recovery of this room. The oak floorboards that are in the room today were purchased by George Howard way back in 1957 at the demolition sale of Lowther Castle in Cumbria. Now, since arriving at Castle Howard, those floorboards were salted away for nearly 30 years before being put to use in the cabinet room in the late 1980s. And it was really quite an extraordinary act of faith on the part of George Howard to have purchased oak flooring that he felt could one day be put to use at Castle Howard, especially given that in the 1950s, the house was still ruined and haunted by the fire of a decade earlier. And indeed, we could say that without his energy and determination, it's quite possible that the story might have been reversed and that there would have been a Castle Howard demolition sale in 1957, at which its oak flooring and other fixtures would have been for sale. Shortly after this, the Garden Hall was restored, and the filming of the first Brideshead Revisited at Castle Howard by Granada Television presented this opportunity for recovery. If we look at the sequence of 4 pictures and move clockwise from the top left, we see before the fire, the dismal picture after the fire. You can see how high you can look up because the floor above has plunged down in the blaze. Then you see on the bottom right, the scene from Granada's Brideshead Revisited, where Jeremy Irons as Charles Ryder paints his murals. The room had been reconstructed with a grant towards this from Granada Television, and it was rebuilt by the architect Julian Bicknell. And then after the film crew had left, the set was dismantled and the room decorated, as you see on the bottom left, with a series of murals by the New Zealand artist Felix Kelly, a friend of the family. And these depict imaginary Vanbrugh buildings. One of the most important projects in recent decades, but one that has hardly been seen by the public, has been the re-roofing of the whole of the central block of the house, replacing the temporary covering of 50 years ago with a proper lead-lined roof. And for each of these sections, the old roofing had to be stripped away. Here we see the corrugated asbestos sheeting on one of the sections. This was removed and new timbers and purlins laid down, and in time these would be clad with wood as well, prior to being eventually covered with lead. And here you see the sequence from start to finish on the screen in front of you now. And this was repeated for each of the sections of the roof. And at the same time, high-level work included refurbishing some of the stonework in the chimney stacks and repointing, and also the lead work for the downpipes and the rain hoppers. And you'll see, even though these are 50, 60 feet above ground, that it's no excuse for not including the family crest and the date 1994 on the outside of the lead piping there. No detail is spared. And with the roof secure, it was of course possible to begin to restore some of the rooms directly beneath. First of all, Lady Cawdor's room at the top of your screen here, and on the bottom of your screen, the Admiral's room, both recovered from gutted shells following the fire. Lady Cawdor's room had in fact been burnt twice in the 20th century. It had caught fire in 1932, so it was a very unlucky space. But today, both rooms have been fully restored. And then a good stroke of fortune occurred in 2007, when Miramax Films decided they wanted to shoot a second movie version of Brideshead Revisited at Castle Howard. And far from being daunted by the famous television series of a quarter of a century earlier, the producers felt sufficiently inspired by the house to take over one of the derelict areas in the High South and construct an entirely new set. And so we see the High Saloon on the screen now. The familiar pattern of pictures on the left, how it looked prior to the fire. On top right, you will see the area after the fire. It had been used as a lumber area for decades afterwards, and the old doorway bricked up. And then the room as converted by the set builders for the movie version. And they created a painted interior, very different to the original one, but it does give a flavor of what a painted chamber must have felt like. And by a very curious repetition of history, you have this painted, restored room directly above the recreated garden hall from the Brideshead of Granada Television in the space directly below. And this has also meant that we've been able to open areas of the upper level of the house to the public for the first time in the visiting history of the house since 1952. Well, so far, we've seen examples of joined up recovery, taking projects a stage at a time, planning, budgeting, and phasing them into the broader picture of expenditure. And planning is all very well and sensible in a benign world, but often things derail such planning. Things threaten to drop out of the sky, either metaphorically or in this next example, quite literally. At the end of 2005, it was discovered that the Georgian skylight on the west wing of the house was held up by little more than fresh air. Under this glass canopy steps every visitor of the house, and you can see on the picture on your left how at the top of the grand staircase as you enter the house, you have the skylight above with the canopy over the top of that. It's the canopy that was in danger at that point in 2005, and it represented a very serious health hazard. So the result of this alarming discovery was an urgent repair program during the winter of 2005-2006, when fortunately the house was closed. And this cost £125,000, expenditure that was entirely unplanned for and which inevitably resulted in delaying other projects and investment plans. Now, turning our attention to the outdoors and going back in time, by the 1970s, the grandest structure of all in the landscape, Hawksmoor's Mausoleum, begun in 1729 and completed in 1744, was in urgent need of stabilization. And this magnificent edifice, generally reckoned to be the finest mausoleum in Northern Europe, is supported by 18 columns, which over the years had started to bulge and disintegrate as the iron cramps within the stonework corroded with rust and cracked the stone slabs. And of course, this cycle of decay would have been accelerated by frost and water damage. The building was in serious danger of collapse. The estate negotiated with a grant to assist in this enormous project, which was defined by 3 phases. First, making the building safe by securing the colonnade. Second, restoring the entablature at the top and various other stone features. And then finally, the restoration of the steps and the balustrading leading up to the steps, leading up to the chapel. Well, at the time, this was one of the largest grant-aided projects that had ever been undertaken. And work began by jacking up the entablature in order to remove the columns 2 at a time and rebuild them with a combination of good stone and new stone. It's always the desire to use the old stone if it was still possible to do so. Now, this project was successfully completed, but at that point, the funding was exhausting, having cost in the order of £1.2 million. So to look at the mausoleum today, yes, it is secure, and I will come back to it later in this talk, but as a consequence of the colonnade exhausting the funding, the steps and the balustrading and the rest of the entablature were never tackled. And then in 2003, we saw the completion of another 10-year project that was to restore all the lead statues in the grounds at Castle Howard. This began 10 years earlier and was assisted by English Heritage. And today, 18 of these life-size figures have been restored or rebuilt. They date from the early 18th century, when the woods and gardens were filled with a vast profusion of lead figures. And the survival of so many lead sculptures at Castle Howard is in many ways rather surprising. Lead is not subject to the same kinds of deterioration as stone or marble, but as a soft metal, it's prone to distortion and collapse. Hence the not uncommon sight in British gardens of lead figures propped up by poles, as you see on the left. And these hollow figures can also be attacked from within through the rusting iron supports and deteriorating core material, both of which are susceptible to frost and water damage. And here you see on the right a splintered figure that had begun to fracture apart as bits of it fell off from the cycle of decay. And it too has a pole trying to secure it in an upright position. This is the Apollo Belvedere. Well, once removed from their pedestals, each statue was taken to a workshop. Small apertures were made in the back of the figure and all the old core material removed, together with the corroded iron supports that had often caused the distortion and damage. And here you see on the right how the new stainless steel supports were inserted inside these hollow figures. Stainless steel to guarantee against future decay, and also to maintain the figure in its correct posture. This is really important, again, because lead being so heavy and pliable. And these steel pins that you see in the drawing here on the right, they extend out of the bottom of the statue about 18 inches from the bottom of each foot or the base of the statue. And these are very important because they will help secure the statue on its pedestal when it is returned into situation. And here you see the Farnese Hercules weighing 1.5 tons being winched back into position. Now, some of the figures, like the Hercules, were rather straightforward, but others, like the dancing faun, were more complex. You'll see in the black and white photograph on the left, the faun has something like a gigantic band around its stomach. This was a device to stop it from bending in the middle of its torso. This was felt to be where it was at risk. In fact, when it tumbled off its pedestal, the problems had been lower down, as you can see, with the fractured feet at the bottom of its legs. This meant that new feet had to be cast. First of all, in plaster, and here we have the right-hand foot. The foot is resting on an instrument, a musical instrument called a scabellum, which is rather like a foot-operated castanet. Here it is on the plaster on the left, and then cast in lead and reattached to the base of the legs of the lead figure. And you'll see the pins sticking out from the bottom. And here in the next sequence of images, you'll see a reverse view showing the pins as they extend out of the feet. And on the bottom left, you'll see how there have been pilot holes drilled into the stone plinth that it is going to rest on, that these can guide the pins into there. And here you see it on the right, being lowered down by a teleporter with straps into the correct position. And this procedure was repeated with all of the statues. The grant aid was conditional on the figures surviving wholly or substantially prior to repair. So there was no question of replacing some of the dozen or so figures lost completely, but 2 missing figures were rebuilt from scratch by ourselves, but without any grant aid. And the 18 figures in the grounds today represent one of the largest collections in the UK. Now let's cast our eyes further afield and look at what other work has been undertaken. The Carmire Gate on the approach to Castle Howard, built by Hawksmoor in the 1720s, when even in his wildest dreams he could not have imagined the sort of traffic that would thunder through the arch in the course of the 20th century, and each large wagon would gradually chip a little bit more of the stonework away. So in 1999, this was refurbished, again with grant aid from English Heritage. So the arch was strengthened, the crenellations repointed on the walls, and the little polygonal turrets at either end were refurbished as well. Further along the avenue, as you arrive towards Castle Howard, is Vanbragh's obelisk at the head of the drive, 70-foot high shaft that was repaired in 2004. The stonework on the 4 sides of the shaft were repointed, and most importantly at the top, the apex was rebuilt. It started to crumble away so that it now has a satisfactorily pointy point at the very top, which has a small lightning conductor in it as well, absolutely essential. And then at the base, with permission from the Highways Agency and Rydale, we created a new roundabout. It seems extraordinary that prior to that, there was no roundabout that guarded the base of the obelisk from passing traffic. So again, it had suffered from careless drivers swinging past over the years. So this simple little measure has been an additional form of protection for the stonework at the base of the obelisk. 2 years earlier, though, another giant structure on the avenue had been restored. This was the 7th Earl's monument. Now, this is a 19th century monument erected in 1868 to the memory of the 7th Earl. It was restored in the course of 2002. This is a picture of how it looked before work began on the left, and an early black and white photograph shows a rather strange structure at the very top. This was a metal structure that was a large brazier, gilded brazier on a tripod. All of that had been lost by a lightning strike in the 20th century. So one of the most important things was to rebuild the stonework at the top of the structure in order for it to be able to support a new version of the brazier on these swan neck tripod legs and these gilded kind of pieces of metal shaped as flames. And that is how the monument looks today, like a gigantic Roman candle, really, because with the gilded brazier at the top, the sunlight will catch that and it will be gleaming from miles away. Again, this was generously supported by English Heritage. And they too have helped us in a more recent project with the mock fortification walls. Now these stretch out for roughly a third of a mile to the east and the west of the Gatehouse. The Gatehouse you'll see at the top of the picture on the top here, and these are the walls. This is the western section, and you can see the beginning of the eastern section on this side of the picture. Here we see the eastern section at ground level. All of these walls were carefully repointed and repaired on the elevations and on the top. And at the very end, the tower that you have just seen, here it is again on the right. In fact, only half of it was in existence before this work began. So the missing portion was rebuilt. And altogether, this work with help from Natural England, as well as English Heritage, meant that it cost in the region of £1 million to complete. Just beyond the walls on the same ridge sits Hawksmoor's Pyramid of 1728. And inside it's hollow with a gigantic bust of the 3rd Earl of Carlisle's Tudor ancestor, Lord William Howard. Well, the facades were cleaned. It was a very black looking structure before work began. The stonework was repaired, the missing sections reinstated, cramp work damage was repaired. Again, a suitable pointy point was reinstated on the apex. And really importantly, at the base, around the square plinth of the pyramid, all the vermiculation, that is the small kind of worm-like holes that you get in the stonework, all of that had disappeared, bar one single piece of stonework for that. So all of this was retooled and new blocks put in to give it the original appearance it had from the 18th century. Well, I've been discussing a lot about the built heritage, and I just briefly want to say that, of course, much of our work has involved the natural heritage. And a couple of weeks ago, you heard me talk about the restoration of the lakes and the waterways. And one of the most recent projects for us has been the restoration of the Lime Avenue. And that will be the subject of a separate talk in the near future. But generally, this summary of work is, of course, impressive, not to say exhausting and expensive. And it testifies to the family's enduring commitment to preserve Castle Howard. But this by no means exhausts the list of work outstanding. And restoration is, in fact, the lifeblood of Castle Howard. The cycle of work lies at the heart of the dynamic of who we are. But what we might ask, is there left to do? Well, here it depends whether you're a glass half full or a glass half empty person. The mausoleum on your top left requires something like £10 million to make it secure. The southeast wing of the house on the top right of your screen remains essentially a shell from the fire of 1940 with a temporary roof. Has been used as an exhibition area and a storage area, but the conditions are not really suitable for precious objects to be inside there. The basement level is also derelict too, and it's hoped in time to be able to restore this part of the house, perhaps to return them to a historic interior, or maybe build a purpose-built museum-grade exhibition space or a function space. All of these come with a heavy price tag, as do the Pellegrini frescoes on the bottom of your picture here. These still show damage from the fire, and the estimated price tag to conserve and clean these is north of £1 million. And then there's the problem of the Gatehouse, which has lain empty for several decades. We need to take a decision over how best to preserve and recover this structure. It began life as a pyramid arch built by Vanbrugh in 1718, with the wings added in the 1750s to create a guest house or inn. And it continued to function as a hostelry until the end of the 19th century. Today, there's an estimated price tag of £2 million to put the building right, weatherproof, wind-tight, waterproof, and secure. And this is an enormous capital outlay. And the question then has to be asked, what would be the best commercial model that would guarantee a healthy return for this level of investment? We've looked at various options: a small hotel, holiday apartments, let office units. All of these are under review. But rather excitingly, we're hoping in the near future to set some students from the architecture school at Yale on this problem and see what they come up with as part of a developing relationship we have with Yale. So much remains to be done, but I think it's important to stress just how much has been achieved in the 80 years since the fire. And of course, the task is never ending. New challenges and problems appear all the time. And undoubtedly, one of the major issues we face is climate change and extreme weather, which has seen exceptionally violent and heavy rainfall in recent years, which has caused internal flooding. This is a picture of a cloudburst in August 2 years ago, when rain came down solidly for an hour and a half, flooding the cellars beneath the West Wing, as you can see in the top right of the picture, and the water coming into the long gallery on the bottom right of your picture. This is undoubtedly going to be a problem that all historic houses face: extreme weather, cold, wet, dry, humidity. And the sky also has a nasty propensity to fall in for a second time. A few years ago, inspection of the octagon dome on the West Wing identified inside the structure slippage in some of the brick footings and evidence of beetle damage in the timbers. So today, this repair program is actually, I'm pleased to say, close to completion, having begun last September in 2019, with the timbers inside braced and the old lead on the roof replaced. The sheeting and scaffolding has largely come down, and the workmen are due to leave in the next 2 or 3 weeks. So this chronicle of restoration points to some of the economic realities that underpin the financial well-being of the estate. And Castle Howard is no different to many similar places across the UK. Rich in assets, but always having to work hard to generate a cash income that gets swallowed up with frightening speed by all the restoration tasks. So how actually do we generate income for these projects and for everyday maintenance and running costs? Well, farming has traditionally been the mainstay of country estates. Of the 5,000 acres or so of farmland, about a half is tenanted between 8 farms, and the remainder farmed on the estate's behalf by a contract company. And the arable enterprise includes barley, wheat, and oats. And until recently, one very important operation has been contract potato growing, with nearly 300 acres devoted to potatoes for the French fry or oven chip market. So these humble tubers can provide vital support for Castle Howard, from early sowing to perhaps something like 6,000 tonnes of harvested potatoes per annum, depending on the size of the crop each year. But as with so many things in agriculture, the margins from potatoes have fluctuated over the years. And one solution in recent times has been to turn to beef production, which involved significant capital startup costs, but now yields a steady income especially as we can sell the meat through the farm shop on the estate, which opened in 2004 and specializes in local produce and capitalizing on the huge fashion for food provenance. This venture necessitated something like a £600,000 investment. It is now a popular destination for local shoppers, no more so than in recent weeks with the lockdown across the country. Forestry is also an important activity on the estate, with nearly 2,000 acres of woodland that are managed for commercial timber production and amenity value too. And the woods divide equally between coniferous and deciduous planting. And harvested timber is used for posts and planking and furniture making, but the returns from forestry can fluctuate too, and woodland management in itself can be a significant overhead. So one of the secrets to economic survival is to diversify, to ensure that the impact of a reduced income in one area can be offset by a revenue stream elsewhere. The estate owns 160 properties. About 90 cottages are let on the open market. And recently, the rental portfolio has been expanded to include commercial rents from the conversion of former farm buildings here at Easthorpe, which have generated 15,000 square feet of office space. But properties, no matter what age or size or purpose, always require continual attention, especially if they are to command realistic rents. So they must be upgraded and improved all the time. And one of our recent departures has been to convert 3 cottages in the village of Conisthorpe on the top left of your screen into holiday cottages to see what that market is like. And caravans are good business as well, with many people choosing prime rural locations for effectively a second or holiday home. In 2001, the estate invested £750,000 into upgrading the site, which had first opened back in the 1960s beside the Great Lake. You can see on the bottom left of your screen, there is the house, there is the Great Lake, and there is the caravan site on the far side. This is an aerial view from the opposite direction. And then the top pictures, you'll see work during the refurbishment of the area when the ground became immensely chewed up, but how it looks today once it has grown back and been landscaped. And this is a very important revenue earner, generating more income, in fact, than all the let farmland. And people who pass snobbish comments about the proximity of caravans to Castle Howard should actually ponder this rate of return, which makes it very hard to gainsay such a project. It is an important investment for us. And then there are all those visitors as a major heritage attraction. More than 270,000 through the turnstiles into the house and gardens last year, plus all the visitors to outdoor events such as concerts, special weekends, private functions, and Christmas, which has become increasingly important in our annual turnover. And allied to these are the various retail operations, including shops and cafeterias and a garden centre. And these have received more than £1 million worth of investment since 2000 in upgrading and improving them. Now, we rely on visitors of all sorts. So what you're about to see is among the most important piece of information you will come across at Castle Howard. Quite simply, food and lavatories. We're judged on the state of our lavatories and the quality of our cups of tea. 3 winters ago, the cafeteria in the house was refurbished at a cost of more than £100,000. This was 20 years after its previous refit. And during the earlier operation, the public lavatories to the side of the house had also to be refitted. These cost in the region of £120,000. Now, this was not a simple matter of refurbishing the inside. It was far more complex. These lavatories are situated beneath the north forecourt at the front of the house. And in order to seal this area, 120 large flagstones had to be taken up, stacked in the correct order before the surface beneath them could be treated, and then the stones replaced exactly how they were beforehand. This is the example of so much hidden work that lies behind improvement, restoration, and refurbishment. So maintaining an estate of this size and nature means that expenditure on upkeep and opening to the public must be pragmatically determined. Income directed to essential repairs or renewals like worn floors, eroded stonework, and upgrading plumbing and electrical cabling and fire systems. And improvement and investment also have to be directed to the visitors' facilities, the cafeteria, the public lavatories, pathways, car park, and so on. And many of these tasks are far from being glamorous restorations, but they are no less important. And many of them are cyclical too. So take, for example, the phased repair of windows around the house on the right-hand side and the bottom left there. Where possible, the old frame and glazing are retained, but where necessary, new wood and glass have to be fitted. Well, each window might cost around £2,000 to repair. There are in excess of 100 windows like this on the building. Such is the magnitude of the task. And alongside all of this, restoration of artworks has to compete with these projects. And because these chattels are deeply valued and recognized as important to the meaning of Castlehad, they also receive a share of the funding cake. So over the years, there's been a program of continuous restoration, which has included books, furniture, silver, and paintings. Among the most recent has been the cleaning of this portrait by the 16th century artist Girolamo Bedoli of a group of Italian noblemen at prayer, a picture that rather confusingly began life as two separate canvases. So not only do objects of great age need looking after, but today's increasingly discriminating visitors have high expectations. Gone are the days of dark houses with poor lighting, scruffy rooms, moth-eaten fabrics, and dirty paintings. We have to present them to the highest standard possible, as you see here with the music room and its Tudor portrait of the Duke of Norfolk by Holbein. We have a duty of care for all of these diverse items and a responsibility to bring this immense historical wealth to life for the benefit of the wider public. And so the meaning of Castlehad has to be understood against this broader backdrop. House, collections, landscape, business activities, and restoration work, 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 and more work. Each of these multifarious strands is important in its own right and requires specialized understanding and attention, whether we're talking about old master paintings, the condition of particular monuments, the state of certain woodlands, or the quality of lavatories and cups of tea. The point is that all of these elements bind together. The estate is an integrated whole. So the health of the picture collection should be as important to the farm manager as should be the health of his beef herd to me, the curator. The Tudor portrait is linked to the butchery counter in the farm shop, from Holbein to Hamburgers. Well, thank you very much, and I'm very happy to take any questions that you might have about what we've been up to in the recent decades.
Just a question maybe to start off, Chris. You mentioned the challenge that the Mausoleum presents. Is it worth just kind of explaining a little bit more about some of the ongoing work to the Mausoleum and why that is such a challenge?
There are a number of problems. One is obviously unfinished business from the previous restoration work at the 1970s. And obviously you see the steps in the right-hand picture there. These have got to be restored, and the entablature at the top. But there are enormous problems in terms of cramp damage. So the iron cramps, imagine a giant or a very large iron staple that as it were, pins blocks of stone together. As these rust, they crack the stone, and water and frost exacerbate this cycle of damage. So literally pieces of stone fall off, and the stability of the building comes under threat. Similarly, on the lead cupola at the top of the mausoleum, rather faintly visible in this picture here, that lead needs replacing. So there's a lot of water ingress into the building, and that of course breeds all sorts of problems. And there are other fundamental structural problems. It is a circular building, and circular buildings naturally want to push outwards. So it's clear that in that vertical structure, there are 1, 2, possibly 3 bands of ironwork, or probably interlinked cramps that, as it were, hold that building together to stop it from bursting outwards. So the cost is enormous because of, first of all, many surveys that have to be undertaken to be absolutely certain of the condition of the building, and getting scaffolding up to that high level, and then simply replacing a lot of the stonework. So that's why it's a complicated project and has such a high price tag to it.
Thanks very much, Chris. We do have one question that's come in so far. If you do have any questions that you do want to ask, again, just hover down to the bottom of your screen and press that chat button to type it, or if you press the raise hand button on the participants tab, will unmute you so you can ask. The question that's come in, Chris, is it's asking, plywood that was used in the repair of the top of the Temple of the Four Winds seems flimsy as a product. Do you just want to kind of explain that a little bit?
Well, this was back in the 1950s, and that cladding, it would have most likely been a marine cladding, something like that. Perhaps something a little bit superior than you might get down at your local B&Q centre. But that would be the way you do it. You would put a timber cladding over the skeleton frame before actually applying the leadwork to it, which would have been hammered into position. That's, you know, more than half a century ago, that work. I mean, it's stood up well, but I'm sure will require attention in the coming decades. But importantly, the woodwork inside the structure is secure. There isn't the same difficulties we had with beetle damage and kind of dry rot that had been present just after the Second World War.
Thank you very much. I'd be interested to know the answer to this one, Chris, because I don't know the answer to it. Is why is the Carmire Gate so called?
Well, there is a boggy patch just to the north when you go through it, and a tiny little stream runs there. So that gives you the mire bit, okay? The car bit, I'm not quite sure on that one. You stumped me on that one. Okay.
We'll have to come back to you on that one.
There is,
Alan.
but in fact, I will say that in the past, it has sometimes been referred to as Cowmire Gate.
Okay.
So there's these words have a kind of history to them, a kind of the etymology. They might change, but Cowmire, Carmire, that's how it seems to have been referred to. So
we might be calling it the wrong thing to this day, then.
You might be calling it the right thing for the wrong reasons, or the right reasons.
Thank you very much. Another question here: how many people do we employ at the moment in connection with maintenance and repairs? If you know the answer to that one.
Well, the maintenance, we have a very small in-house team of general contractors, a mason, a joiner, and then we tend to use outside contractors, but quite often people that we've used for a long time in terms of electricians and plumbers, because you need the continuity of knowledge inside a complicated large set of buildings. On big projects such as the Mausoleum, we have a kind of interesting debate, as all places like this would have. Is it cheaper and more efficient to go with an in-house team, even if that means, as it were, expanding an in-house team because you've got them on site all the time as direct labor working away? Or is it actually better to put the job out to tender and see what an external contractor will come up with? You've got issues then which mean you have to pay VAT, for example. This is a debate that kind of flips backwards and forwards. It rather depends on the scale and complexity and the duration of the job in question. But if you went back 100 years, there would have been a building services team, a maintenance team, much, much larger than we have today. That's the case across most estates, partly because mechanization means that you've got machines that can do a lot of work, but it tends to be sometimes more economic to go with external contractors who also have the experience of working in a specific area of, say, you know, old stonework or old timber work or things like that.
And I guess that leads on quite nicely in a way to, you mentioned at the beginning of the talk about Yale's involvement and how we kind of work with Yale and some of their students. Is it worth just explaining maybe a little bit more about how we work with Yale and why?
We work with Yale in the sense that for the last, I don't know, 12 years or more, a group of their architecture graduates comes to Castle Howard as part of a week-long field trip to the UK looking at gardens and landscapes. And the architecture students, this group are taking a particular sort of landscape component, but they're looking at buildings too. Yale, the school itself is very interested in Castle Howard, and they brought some of their directors and benefactors over, again, to have a look at places in the UK where students have gone for study and so on. And we had a talk about how could students become more involved with projects at Castle Howard. These are architecture students, so that they need to start thinking about how they're going to become professionals when they eventually graduate. And what we thought would be quite interesting would be to get a mixture of students to come to Castle Howard. So not just students from the School of Architecture, but students from the School of Forestry, which is the nearest they have to a kind of landscape school, and say to them, right, here is a structure, let's say the Gatehouse. What are you going to do to restore this and make this kind of sustainable? But we thought, rather than just have architecture and landscape students, because the architecture student might come up with very nice designs, the landscape student might set it in a very nice kind of garden setting and so on, let's add one other department from Yale, its world famous business school, so that a business graduate would come along and could say to his or her colleagues, well, that's a lovely design, but it's not going to work as part of a business package here. Because each of these disciplines, when they become professionals, they're going to have to take account of other pressures and questions that need to be asked in any project. So it might look good, but does the economics stack up? The economics might stack up, but does it look good? So we felt that this was going to be a really useful kind of case study for them with some of our structures. We were due to kind of start that modestly next year, but at the moment, as we know, with the current crisis, all bets are off in terms of the certainty of what we can do. But we can do some of this remotely by the virtue of things like Zoom, but obviously the appeal for Yale was that their students could actually get to grips with a real building and a real landscape in Yorkshire.
Brilliant. And someone's actually solved the mystery of what Cars means, Chris, as well. Apparently, Cars are wetlands that are dominated by shrubs rather than trees.
So Carr and Meyer would be kind of, you know, the same sort of thing. But yeah, thank you very much for that.